Hey guys, and welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, my name's Georgia, and on my platforms here on the internet, I focus on mostly unsolved true crime. As I'm sure a lot of you know by now, if you've been hanging around here for a while, doe cases are the thing I feel most passionately about in the true crime community. Like the thought of somebody losing their life and then just being forgotten forever, not even so much as a name on their headstone. That really bothers me. It's my worst nightmare and I don't want that for anyone. So I try and spread the word as much as I can in the hope that maybe we can help identify someone. Although doe cases do historically perform among the worst on my channel, I will not give up trying to spread the word. Although weirdly, in a bit of a side note, doe cases seem to perform really well on my podcast, and I'd love to know why that is. Like, why is there that disparity between YouTube and podcasts? I have no idea. The Jane Doe we're going to be talking about today is known by the media and by the authorities as the cheerleader in the trunk for reasons we're going to be covering at length in this episode. Right off the bat though, I do want to say don't focus too much attention on the cheerleader part, as there is a very high likelihood that she was never a cheerleader at all, and I don't want that to sort of mislead anyone. I do suspect that the media and investigators went in with that moniker very early on, as it's undeniably a lot more catchy than just the Frederick County Jane Doe. However, I do fear that the name may have backfired, especially in more recent years. Perhaps there are people out there with a missing loved one who've heard the name cheerleader in the trunk and then have just immediately dismissed it as being their person because they weren't a cheerleader. Perhaps not, of course, but it's just something I couldn't get out of my head whilst researching this case. Just don't focus too much on the cheerleader thing. Although, on the other hand, if she were simply just the Frederick County Jane Doe, maybe this case would have just completely fallen into obscurity, who knows. The point is, just don't focus too much on the cheerleading thing. On the 24th of August 1982, two men were out hunting for mushrooms in Gambrel State Park just northwest of Frederick in western Maryland. Frederick is a city that would have had a population of around 30,000 people in 1982, so it was a fairly small place at this time, but a place with a long and complicated history. The specific area in which the men were searching that day is known as the Frederick City Watershed because of the water that drains from there into the city's reservoir. It is the perfect climate for mushrooms. Gambrel State Park as a whole though just provides miles of hiking, mountain biking, horse trails with the most beautiful views of the surrounding area. It is the last place you'd expect to come across a body, but as you can probably guess, that is exactly what the mushroom hunters found on that sad day just off of a gravel roadway. Whilst out searching for their mushrooms, they spot an old steamer trunk, something which is very obviously out of place in this woodland. A steamer trunk is a piece of luggage which you might today mostly recognise from old movies or old TV. It's a square or domed storage box used for storing your clothing and other belongings when you travel. They specifically get their name as steamer trunks because they were designed to be suitable for use in the stateroom of a steamer, which is a type of boat propelled by, you guessed it, steam. A steamer trunk was designed to be shallow enough to be stowed under a berth, but they just sort of became known by that name in general, so all these kinds of trunks were all steamer trunks. It's said that the trunk was incredibly badly disguised in the woodland. It kind of seemed like somebody dumped it here, and then as an afterthought, they just threw a few twigs and leaves over the top. But they didn't try very hard to hide it. It was still incredibly easy to spot. Of course, curiosity got the best of the hunters and they decided to go and have a look at what was inside the trunk. Maybe they expected to find some old treasure, maybe some old clothes, maybe nothing. I don't think they expected to find what they did, which was of course skeletal human remains. Although it was clear these remains had been there for quite a while, immediately after the discovery, the hunters headed back into civilization and contacted the authorities, who turned up at the scene as soon as possible. Lieutenant Tom Chase would later say of the discovery, they came upon this trunk and what they found inside were the remains of the victim that were literally melted because of the heat. Authorities found that the remains still had a head of long brown hair, but other than that, little could be ascertained at the scene, and the remains still inside the trunk were transported to the Smithsonian Forensic Science Lab to begin the investigation, to figure out who the remains belonged to so the crime could be solved. I don't think on this very first day they expected this case would still be unsolved 40 years down the line, and not just unsolved, that the victim would still not have a name. After a full analysis of the remains, they managed to come up with a vague profile of the victim. She was female, likely white, 5'2" to 5'6", and 100 to 130 pounds. She had dark brown, medium-length wavy hair, but the authorities believed that it had been dyed thanks to her pubic hair being more of sort of an auburn or reddish-brown shade. Now, if that is the case and her hair was dyed, I suspect that her hair must have been recently dyed before her death, otherwise they would have been able to say with certainty thanks to natural growth on her roots, but nothing mentions that. Thanks to the level of decomposition, her eye colour remains unknown and her age is also very hard to narrow down. They said back in 1982 that she could have been as young as 17 but could also have been as old as 45, which really doesn't help to narrow much down. You'll find that a lot of the composite sketches from back in the early 80s will depict Jane Doe as on the older end of the spectrum. However, in more recent years, her age estimate has been narrowed down to sort of 17 to 27 by the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, so the chances are she was young. There was nothing found in the trunk that could have helped with her identification, like not even any clothes. Jane Doe was found completely nude by a dark coloured towel that had been wrapped around her body. She didn't have any jewellery or anything like that on, and thanks to the level of decomposition, she didn't even have any fingerprints left. But what she did have was a clearly very extensive dental history. For many, many years before today's use of DNA in the Doe world, dental charts were one of the most important things when it came to identification. Each person has a unique set of teeth, and if you visit the dentist, they will have on file your chart, mostly for medical or dental use of course, but God forbid it's ever needed, they will share your charts with the authorities for the sake of identification. Jane Doe had had extensive dental procedures done in her life, including 2 crowns on her left front teeth, a root canal, and numerous fillings. She had one gold-filled tooth on the right upper side and several silver fillings as well. This is a lot of dental work for somebody most likely in their teens or early 20s, and you can imagine the investigators thought at the time that this would be a slam dunk, that they'd soon find these very distinctive dental records and find Jane Doe's name. But of course, that didn't happen. Now, usually the way this happens is the authorities contact all the dentists in the local areas who go through their records and look for matches. Of course, this was a time before records would have been digitised, so it would have been literal manual searching through records. We also find in a lot of cases where there's no luck with local dentists that authorities then place the details in dental magazines or publications in order to spread the word even further, maybe even across the whole country. But of course, not every single dentist in the country is going to come across this information. The fact that no dentist in the local area had Jane Doe's records potentially suggests that Jane Doe wasn't local to Frederick, or maybe even local to Maryland, or at least she didn't get the dental work done locally. Her extensive dental works led to a lot of speculation over the years that perhaps Jane Doe was a dental student herself, as some of the procedures were very consistent with those that would have been performed by dental students. Now, I don't know if it's the done thing today that dental students would have practiced on each other, but in this time, maybe it was. I suppose it makes sense. Or perhaps she went to a dental school to get work done, a real head for students to practice on, as that would have been cheaper than the alternative. Lieutenant Tom Chase would later say to NBC4 in 2005, forensic dentists had produced a dental chart that indicates she had work done at a dental school. According to these dentists, the type of dental work she had done aren't done as frequently in the practice of dentistry, but they are still taught to people who are going to practice dentistry. So either Jane Doe was a dental student and all the students practiced on each other, or she couldn't afford to go to a proper dentist but still wanted to take care of herself, so went to a dental school. Despite the extensive dental work, Jane Doe also had 2 skewed wisdom teeth in her palate that would have caused her a lot of pain in life, and she may have complained about this on a regular basis. A decade or so ago, images of Jane Doe's teeth were put into an online database, so if old physical records are now getting digitised, there's always a chance they could find a match, but that is a very, very slim chance. A lot of identity rule-outs have been made thanks to the dental chart, so lots of people who could have potentially otherwise been good matches have been struck off. As well as the dental work though, there was also another big identifying feature of Jane Doe, the fact that she was found to have spondylosis. Taken directly from the Cleveland Clinic website, spondylosis is the medical term for a small crack or fracture between two vertebrae in your spine, the vertebrae being one of the 33 bones that make up your spinal column. It's also sometimes referred to as pars defect or pars fractures because it affects your pars interarticularis, I think I said that right, which are the tiny ridges of bone that link your vertebrae together, kind of like a puzzle. Spondylosis most commonly affects your lower back, which is the lumbar spine, but can also happen in your neck, so your cervical spine, or your middle back, your thoracic spine. Experts estimate that spondylosis affects less than 10% of Americans each year, and Cleveland Clinic is an American site, hence why it's American. And it's much more common in kids and teens, especially in children who play contact sport. The website specifies sports like football, gymnastics, or weightlifting. I also saw horse riding mentioned a lot, which makes sense, a lot of pressure on your lower spine. Cheerleading also very much falls under that category, hence her nickname, the cheerleader in the trunk. Also, really interestingly, spondylosis is much more common in people of Indigenous Alaskan descent, with studies finding that people with native Alaskan ethnicity are much more likely to be born with thinner vertebrae. I don't think I've seen it suggested anywhere that Jane Doe could be native Alaskan, I just found that really interesting. Spondylosis isn't necessarily a crippling thing to have. It definitely causes pain, but in varying degrees from person to person. Some people will just have a slight pain, others will be in intense pain and unable to move. It's also not something that can necessarily be fixed. The most common treatments are to just take rest from the sport or sort of physical activity that is causing the stress on your spine. Maybe you'll do physical therapy, or maybe you'll take over-the-counter medications. It very rarely requires surgery and is usually diagnosed through x-rays, MRIs, CT scans. Jane Doe definitely had spondylosis, but whether she knew it or not is another question entirely. She may have suffered with back pain, the people in her life may have known that, but they might not have known it by its medical name. After she remained unidentified, forensic anthropologist Dr. J. Lawrence Angel had a look at the remains, and he had several observations about Jane Doe, which he shared with the news. He spoke of Jane's skull, stating that from its shape alone, he suspects that she was Caucasian and old American, suggesting that her family had been in the USA for at least 3 generations. Although he says this doesn't necessarily mean that she wasn't born abroad, she may have been born elsewhere to American parents, then came back to the country, or maybe it could just be wrong. A lot of forensic anthropology is just guesswork. Very educated guesswork, but guesswork. It's all speculation, but if you're going to trust anyone's opinion on this stuff, a forensic anthropologist is going to be the person who will know. Angel suspected that she was about 5.5 feet tall, which is at the higher end of the coroner's original estimate. He said she was slender-limbed, broad-hipped, and he also said she was likely in her early 20s. The broad skull base and the full round pelvis also says she was probably very well nourished. He speculates that she may have come from a middle-class background or may have been a farm girl. Agreeing with the spondylosis diagnosis, he says the spine shows a lot of stress, suggesting a lot of back bending. My guess is she was a high school gymnast or a dancer. She might have worked in a factory where she was always lifting things. At any rate, she probably suffered back trouble. He also says that other bones suggest that she couldn't have been particularly muscular, and she had very noticeable wear to her pelvis. Then he moves on to her feet, saying that the bones of the heels suggest that she likely wore high heels very often, just the way the bones fitted together. He also points out the bone leading to the small toe, saying that it might have been injured at some point or fractured. Again, this could definitely be a link to contact sports or just highly physical sports. Dancing, gymnastics, cheerleading, there's a lot of pressure on the feet. In terms of a cause of death for Jane Doe, nothing has been able to be ascertained for sure. However, it has been noted that the styloid process, which is what holds the jaw in place below the skull, was broken. Generally, this would suggest strangulation, but also it may have been broken post-mortem, so when Jane Doe was in the trunk. One of the thoracic vertebrae was also darker than the rest, which usually means it had been stained with blood. Again, usually this would point to strangulation, but could equally have happened after she died. We have no idea how long Jane Doe's remains were in the trunk in the woods. It was the height of summer and it was very, very, very warm, so decomposition would have been sped up if she died in the previous few weeks. Experts say she could have died anywhere from early spring 1982 to 10 years beforehand, so that makes the timeline here 1972 to 1982, which makes it really hard to narrow down her possible identity to people who went missing in this time frame. The trunk itself has been described as relatively new in newspaper articles from the time, but there's no context as to how new is new. I assume over 10 years old. Over the years, there have been a lot of composite sketches created of Jane Doe. Some depicted her as older and some as younger. From what I can gather, the most recent reconstruction is this one by the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. There's also this one by Carl Koppelman from 2012, and this one released by the Frederick Police Department, and many, many more. Obviously, my podcast listeners, you are not going to be able to see this. I would recommend just giving it a Google. In more recent drawings, she generally has a thin face, long hair and a larger curved nose. In most depictions, she also has her hair pulled back, as is suspected a cheerleader, dancer or gymnast would most likely do. As Sergeant Don Stool of the Charles County Sheriff's Office said in 2012, it is a gamble to make assumptions like this that she would have had her hair tied back in life, but it is the kind of information that could spark recognition, and based on what the skeleton tells us, she very likely did do physical activity of some kind. Again, don't focus too much on the cheerleader thing, that's kind of just a catchy nickname for the press, but focus on sport as a whole. Cheerleading, dancing, gymnastics, horse riding, even cycling, anything with pressure on the back, pelvis and feet. There has been a lot of speculation about this case over the years. There are huge threads dedicated to this case on Reddit, Crime Watchers and Web Sleuths where it has been discussed at length. One of the biggest speculations is that Jane Doe was somebody who lived a relatively privileged life. Perhaps she was from a middle-class family. She had parents who devotedly took her to her sporting practices and events. She was well nourished, so likely didn't grow up in poverty. Sports cost money after all. But the question is, how could a family not notice when their beloved daughter just goes missing one day? Devoted parents who spend their kids' teen years ferrying them around are more likely going to report them as missing when one day they just disappear. But maybe Jane Doe was reported as missing and just wasn't from Maryland or any of the surrounding states. Maybe she came from the West Coast or the Midwest, somewhere miles and miles away. In the 1970s/1980s, there wasn't a computerized system. There was no easy way to share information with police stations or sheriff stations in different states. It could very much be that Jane Doe was reported as missing in a different state, and since then she's just fallen through the cracks. We see it happening constantly with old cold cases now being solved. Families who have spent decades searching for their loved ones who are just in a different state and fallen through the cracks. But on the complete other end of the spectrum, others suspect that her skeleton might have shown the where it did because Jane Doe did hard manual labour from a young age. She had to work hard to earn money. Dr. Angel, the forensic anthropologist, did state this is less likely because she wasn't particularly muscular, but it is definitely worth mentioning. This maybe could also suggest that Jane Doe might not have had the loving family, that she was out there trying to make ends meet on her own. This is kind of always the problem with wild speculation in cases, and why in most cold cases I tend to avoid it, because you can make all the assumptions you want, but nothing is ever going to line up perfectly. If we focus too much on the theories that she was a well-off, sporty teenager with loving parents, are people who fall outside of that category going to get forgotten, get ignored? Maybe, probably. If Jane Doe wasn't this sporty teenager, online sleuths have come up with a fantastic alternative, something which could explain the wear on her skeleton perfectly, right down to the wear on her feet. She may have been an exotic dancer, a stripper. This would obviously involve a lot of stress on her spine and pelvis. She would have worn heels on a daily basis. Was she maybe doing this job while she tried to finance herself through dental school? Was she perhaps estranged from loved ones, hence why it seems no missing persons report was ever made? This could also lend theories around her death. The women in this line of work often find themselves subject to more dangerous men. Was it potentially a client at the club? Disappearances of exotic dancers often fall in line with the disappearances of sex workers, ignored by police, brushed off, often not even reported due to the stigma. Of course, please remember these are all just theories, but they could help spark some recognition for someone. Investigators do believe that Jane Doe was possibly last seen alive within a 100-mile radius of where she was found, but they've never shared why they think that, but still that is a pretty wide radius. The fact that Jane Doe was found in the woodland in the steamer trunk suggests to me that she was transported quite a way before being dumped. Otherwise, why would somebody go to the effort of an entire trunk instead of just wrapping her body in something? The perpetrator is also clearly somebody with confidence, someone who didn't necessarily care about Jane Doe's body being found, as they made next to no effort in disguising the trunk in the woodland. It was so easily seen off the gravel road, presumably the same gravel road on which they drove their own vehicle and took the trunk off of. The fact that they were so indifferent to the body being found suggests to me that maybe the perpetrator is somebody who knew that Jane Doe wouldn't necessarily be missed, wouldn't be reported as missing, wouldn't be able to be identified, or if she was identified, they didn't care. It suggests to me that the killer wouldn't be able to be easily linked to her, so he was likely a stranger to Jane Doe. Again, all speculation, but they're things that make sense to me. There have been a number of exclusions in this case over the years, names of missing women who have been put forward and subsequently excluded as being Jane Doe. This is a case that people have spent a lot of time sleuthing online, so there are plenty of names. The list is incredibly long, so I'll put the names on screen, and I'll also leave a link in the notes for my podcast listeners, just in case you're curious and want to see who Jane Doe definitely isn't. So we know we have Jane Doe's dental charts for comparison, and there were no fingerprints available because of the level of decomposition. But what about DNA? Well, according to Doe Network, there's insufficient DNA for profiling, and I couldn't find any solid information about where Jane Doe's remains are today. The best I could really find was from Web Sleuth, where user The Shadow 45 commented in October 2017 that apparently they've been trying to locate her body since at least 2011 for exhumation. I don't know where this information came from, I don't know how true it is, because other sources say that NECMEC got hold of her remains around 2012 and even tried to extract DNA, so who knows? In September 2018, the same user would then comment on Web Sleuth again that Jane Doe only has dentals available after an unsuccessful recent attempt to develop a DNA profile for her. So I'm going to guess that whilst they don't have her entire remains, they might at least have some of them. Her teeth and skull, I'm guessing, but that is a guess. It also seems like they do still have the steamer trunk, and they have done periodic sweeps of that for usable DNA as well. All in all though, it does just seem like Maryland is a particularly frustrating state for cases like this. There's not much transparency, and they have laws in place around the use of forensic familial DNA, more laws than the majority of other US states. They were actually apparently the first state to put in place such laws, which I really don't think is necessarily a bad thing. We have very similar restrictions here in the UK, but when it comes to this case in particular, it is frustrating. Although it does seem like the law has faced some challenges and it's not clear how in place the law still is, so we'll see. So on their site, Doe Network currently has the DNA listed in this case as insufficient for testing. They've had it that way for a long time, but they're not always the best at staying up to date, so I can only hope that as technology improves, the DNA they have will eventually become sufficient. It really does need to be sent to a company like Othram for DNA extraction, but of course that takes time and funding, and I do fear without DNA there will be little chance of identification here, so that is going to be our biggest chance, but again, Maryland has all these laws in place. In October 2022, Identifinders International did express interest in taking on this case to obtain DNA, but I don't know what's been done since then. A lot of the time with things like this, details do remain quite under wraps until they have some more solid information to share, so maybe we can cross our fingers and hope that somebody is working on Jane Doe's case as we speak. But again, don't know. Even if companies like Identifinders and Othram are willing to take on this work though, they do need the cooperation of the involved law enforcement, and again, it's Maryland, they're funny about stuff like this. If DNA doesn't work in this case, then we're going to be relying purely on people's memory. There are lots of people dedicated to this case online, but it needs to be out there in the public consciousness if we want it solved. Somebody might recognise a composite sketch or a detail about her potential past. If you live in or around Frederick, Maryland, make sure you share this story with the people around you. Talk about Jane Doe. Of course, there's a possibility that she could have come from anywhere in the whole country, but the only place we know she was Maryland, and we don't even know if she was there alive. Those with information regarding the identity of Jane Doe are asked to contact the Frederick Police Department at either 301 600 2100 or 301 600 2101. Tips can also be called into the Maryland Chief Medical Examiner at 410 333 3250. I truly believe this is a case that can be solved, or even if it can't be fully solved, Jane Doe can be reunited with her name. There must be somebody out there who recognises her. People have put in so much time and effort into making the reconstructions and finding the details of this case and spreading it online. But as I said, it can stay online all it wants. It needs to be out there in the public. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.